The captain survived the sinking of his ship, but he did not survive what came after it. In the summer of 1945, the war in the Pacific was almost over. Japan was weakening. American forces were moving closer. Men who had spent years crossing dangerous water were beginning to believe they might live long enough to go home. Then USS Indianapolis vanished in the Philippine Sea. The ship went down in minutes. Hundreds of sailors were thrown into dark water with almost no food, almost no fresh water, and no certainty that anyone even knew they were missing. When the rescue finally came, the country wanted a story it could understand. It wanted courage, failure, cause, blame, and someone to carry the weight. The man who carried it was Captain Charles B. McVay III. If stories like this still matter, it is because they ask a hard question. When disaster is too large for one man, why does history sometimes choose one man anyway? Indianapolis had not been sent on an ordinary voyage. She was a heavy cruiser, fast, experienced, and scarred by war. Her crew had served through danger before, and her captain was not a careless officer. McVay came from a Navy family. He knew procedure, command, and the kind of discipline that does not ask how history will remember you later. In July 1945, the ship carried components connected to the atomic bomb that would soon be dropped on Hiroshima. The cargo was secret enough that many aboard did not fully understand the importance of what they had delivered. They only knew they had been ordered to carry something urgent across the Pacific, and they had done it. Indianapolis reached Tinian and completed that mission. Then she was ordered toward Leyte in the Philippines for training and preparation before the next operation. To the men aboard, the hardest part of the war seemed to be behind them. That belief lasted only a few days. After midnight on July 30, 1945, the sea around Indianapolis looked quiet. There was no great surface battle, no warning from a fleet of enemy ships, no dramatic line of guns lighting the horizon. The danger came from beneath the water. Japanese submarine I-58, commanded by Machitsura Hashimoto, found the cruiser and fired torpedoes into the darkness. Two struck home. The explosions tore into Indianapolis with such force that men were thrown from sleep into smoke, flame, and tilted metal. Corridors filled with confusion. Compartments flooded. Lights failed. Some sailors never reached the deck. Others came up into the night and found the ship already dying under them. The cruiser that had crossed the Pacific with secret cargo now had only minutes left. In roughly 12 minutes, Indianapolis was gone. McVay was among the men who survived the sinking itself. That sentence sounds simple until the water is imagined correctly. The ship did not leave behind an orderly group of survivors waiting beside lifeboats. It left oil, debris, scattered rafts, injured men, burned men, men without life jackets, men calling for friends who could not answer. Some had swallowed fuel. Some were bleeding. Some had broken bones. Some tried to hold others above the surface. The night was black, and the sea did not care about rank. In the water, the captain was no longer standing on a bridge with charts and orders around him. He was another body in the ocean, listening to men ask where the ships were, where the planes were, and when help would come. He could not answer them. The worst part was not only that the ship sank. Ships were lost in war. Men in uniform understood that possibility even when they tried not to think about it. The deeper wound was that Indianapolis did not become an emergency quickly enough. She was expected to arrive. She did not arrive. Yet the failure to appear did not immediately bring rescue forces toward her last known path. The mission had been secret, the routing complicated, and Navy communications and reporting procedures failed in ways that later became part of the tragedy. A ship could disappear in wartime and still be treated, for too long, like a problem inside paperwork. Out in the water, survivors had no knowledge of that. They only knew the horizon stayed empty. Every hour changed what survival meant. A man who could speak in the morning might be silent by afternoon. A wound that seemed survivable could become fatal before rescue even knew where to look. The men drifted through heat, thirst, fear, and hallucination. The Pacific did not become kinder because the war was almost over. Salt water damaged mouths and minds. Oil burned skin. Wounds worsened. Some men lost strength and slipped away. Others saw things that were not there. The story is often remembered for sharks, and that part has become almost impossible to separate from Indianapolis. But reducing the ordeal to sharks alone misses the larger horror. The men were not just attacked by the sea. They were abandoned by delay, confusion, and a system that did not understand quickly enough that hundreds of its own sailors were dying in open water. By the time they were spotted from the air, the disaster had already become one of the worst naval losses in American history. Rescue did not arrive as a clean ending. It arrived as proof of how long the men had been missing. Aircraft spotted survivors by chance. Pilots saw oil, debris, and men scattered across miles of ocean. Ships and planes were sent in. Some survivors were pulled out alive after days in the water. Many others were never recovered. Of roughly 196 men aboard, only 316 survived. About 879 were dead. Those numbers are hard to hear because they do not behave like ordinary statistics. They are bunks, watches, letters, photographs, voices, and families waiting for men who would not return. For the survivors, rescue meant life, but it did not mean peace. They came home with memories that could not be explained neatly. McVay came home with the same sea inside him, and with a question already forming around his name. The Navy needed to understand what had happened. That was reasonable. A warship had been lost. Hundreds of men had died. Investigations were inevitable. But an investigation after a catastrophe can move in two very different directions. It can search for the full chain of failure, or it can narrow the story until one person becomes easier to name than the system around him. McVay became that name. He had been the commanding officer. The ship had been his responsibility. No captain escapes that fact, but responsibility and blame are not always the same thing. A captain may be responsible for his ship and still not be the sole cause of every disaster that overtakes it. In the days after the rescue, that distinction mattered more than anyone outside the survivors could understand. The families needed facts. The Navy needed order. The public needed a shape for grief. A single captain was easier to imagine than a chain of missed signals, secret routing, enemy action, and administrative failure. Two accusations shaped the case against him. One involved whether he had ordered abandoned ship in time. The other involved whether Indianapolis had been zigzagging before the torpedoes struck. The abandoned ship issue did not hold in the way the prosecution needed it to hold. Men had been thrown into chaos by a ship that was dying in minutes. The zigzag issue became the center of the conviction. Zigzagging was a defensive maneuver meant to make a ship harder for a submarine to target. On paper, it sounded simple. If a ship knew enemy submarines might be nearby, why not zigzag? But war at sea was rarely that clean. Orders allowed judgment depending on visibility, conditions, and threat information. McVay had not been told everything that might have changed his sense of risk. The water was not a courtroom, and the torpedoes had already chosen their path before lawyers could turn the night into a diagram. The question also had to be judged inside the actual night, not inside the cleaner version later drawn on paper. Indianapolis was moving under wartime routing, with no destroyer escort beside her, and no clear warning that a submarine had been reported in the wider area. A captain at sea had to balance speed, visibility, fuel, fatigue, and orders that left room for judgment. Zigzagging could help in some conditions and mean little in others. To families reading headlines, that sounded like an excuse. To sailors, it was the difference between procedure as written and procedure as lived. McVay had made a judgment inside limited information. The trial later treated that judgment as if the missing information had been available to him all along. The strangest witness in the case was the Japanese commander who had sunk Indianapolis. Hashimoto was brought into the proceedings, and his presence alone showed how unusual the trial had become. The man who fired the torpedoes was asked about the maneuver the American captain had failed to use. His testimony did not give the Navy the simple moral clarity it seemed to want. He indicated that zigzagging would not necessarily have saved the ship. From his position, with the target already sighted and the attack developed, the maneuver might not have changed the outcome. That does not mean McVay did everything perfectly. It means the central charge was far less solid than the public story later made it sound. The court could still find a technical failure. history would do something harsher. It would let the technical failure become the face of 879 deaths. McVay was convicted of negligently hazarding his vessel by failing to zigzag. The sentence itself was later remitted and he returned to duty. On paper, that might look like a limited punishment. In life, it was not limited at all. A court-martial does not end when the papers are filed. It follows a man into rooms, newspapers, reunions, letters, and silence. The captain of Indianapolis became, for many people, the man who had lost the ship. Families who had lost sons wanted answers. Survivors wanted answers. The Navy wanted the disaster contained. A name helped contain it. McVay had one. That was enough for blame to find him. It also gave the public a shorter story than the truth required. Instead of asking how a ship could fail to arrive without alarms moving fast enough, people could ask why one captain had not steered differently in the dark. That kind of question is easier to print, easier to repeat, and easier to believe when grief is looking for a door to kick open. There were other questions that should have stayed beside his name every time the story was told. Why was the ship not missed sooner? Why did routing and reporting failures leave survivors adrift? Why was McVay not given clearer warning about submarine danger along his route? Why did the system focus so tightly on zigzagging, while other procedural failures remained harder to personalize? These questions do not erase command responsibility. They make the story honest. McVay was the captain. He bore weight because captains always do. But the loss of Indianapolis was not the work of one decision in one dark hour. It was a chain of secrecy, assumptions, enemy action, incomplete information, and institutional failure. A chain is harder to punish than a man. It is also harder to explain to parents who have just learned that their sons died after floating for days in the open sea. That is why simplified versions of disasters often survive longer than accurate ones. The survivors understood this more deeply than many people outside the story. They had lived the ocean. They had watched men die after the ship was already gone. They knew the captain had not ordered the submarine to fire. They knew he had not made rescue delayed by days. They knew he was in the water with them. Over time, many survivors came to believe McVay had been treated unfairly. Their defense of him matters because it came from men who had the greatest right to be angry. They did not need to protect his reputation. They had lost friends, brothers, and parts of themselves. Yet many of them still looked at the record and saw something wrong. At reunions and in interviews, the story was not only about what the Japanese submarine had done. It was about what happened afterward, when the men who survived had to watch their captain carry a burden they believed had been placed too narrowly on his shoulders. Their loyalty was not blind. It came from memory. They had seen the disaster from inside it. McVay carried the disaster for the rest of his life. The war ended, but the letters did not. Some grieving relatives blamed him directly. Some messages were cruel. Some arrived years after the sinking, as if the ocean had never released him. The public often talks about war heroes as if they either come home whole or die cleanly in battle. McVay came home into a slower kind of ruin. He had survived the torpedoes, the sinking, the water, and the trial. What remained was memory, accusation, and the knowledge that hundreds of his men had not come back. In 1968, more than 20 years after Indianapolis sank, McVay died by suicide. That fact should not be used cheaply. It should be treated as the final measure of a burden that never really left him. For decades, the official record stood in a way many survivors believed was wrong. Then a new part of the story began, not from an admiral's office, but from a young student asking why. Hunter Scott, a boy working on a school project, began researching Indianapolis and interviewing survivors. What he found helped bring new attention to McVay's case. It is almost hard to believe that a child's history project helped move a matter the Navy had left unresolved for half a century. But sometimes institutions grow used to their own version of events, and an outsider has to ask the question everyone else has learned to step around. The survivors had been asking for years. Scott's work helped make more people listen. Their argument was not that Indianapolis had no captain, or that command had no meaning. Their argument was that the official story had made the smallest possible circle around blame, then asked everyone else to stand outside it. The most powerful part of that effort was not that it made the story simpler. It made the story wider. It put the missed arrival, the secrecy, the rescue delay, and the submarine commander's testimony back into the same frame. Once those pieces were seen together, the old version became harder to defend. Eventually, McVay's record was corrected. Congress passed legislation expressing that he should be exonerated, and the Navy added language to his file. The correction came too late for McVay to see it. It came too late for the families who had spent decades with a distorted version of the story. It came too late for the men who died in the water. But late truth is still different from silence. It does not raise the ship. It does not undo the trial. It does not erase the years of blame. It does, however, force history to say something more careful than the old accusation. McVay was not simply the captain who lost Indianapolis. He was also the captain chosen to carry a disaster that belonged to far more than him. That correction matters because records become memory. Once a file says a thing, textbooks, documentaries, families, and strangers repeat it until the original uncertainty disappears. The lesson is not that commanders should never be held accountable. That would be too easy, and it would be false. Command matters because lives depend on it. Naval officers are entrusted with ships, crews, and decisions that cannot be pushed onto someone else when danger arrives. McVay understood that better than most people who later judged him. The lesson is that accountability becomes dishonest when it is used to hide complexity. A system can call one man guilty while leaving its own failures unnamed. A court can punish a captain for a maneuver while a much larger question sits outside the room. What happened to Indianapolis was not only a sinking, it was also a test of how a military remembers failure when the truth is painful. Good history does not protect leaders from judgment. It protects judgment from becoming too small. There is a reason this story still provokes anger. It touches something older than one ship. Americans know the idea that no one should be left behind. They know the idea that following procedure is not always the same as doing what is right. They know that war creates impossible choices, and that after the shooting stops, people still search for someone to blame. McVay's story sits at the center of all those ideas. He was not a perfect man placed inside a perfect tragedy. He was a professional officer caught inside an imperfect war, commanding a ship the enemy destroyed and a system that later needed explanation. The ocean took his ship. The aftermath took much more. That is why the story still draws veterans, sailors, sons, grandsons, and strangers into argument. Some focus on zigzagging, some focus on rescue, some focus on the bomb mission, some focus on the sharks, but beneath every argument is the same unease. If a disaster this large can be reduced to one man's file, then history can miss the very thing it claims to preserve. When Indianapolis disappeared, the men in the water did not know they were becoming part of one of the most argued naval disasters in American memory. They did not know future generations would debate zigzagging, radio silence, routing, missed arrivals, court-martial records, and exoneration. They knew thirst. They knew wounds. They knew the names of men beside them. They knew the sound of aircraft when rescue finally came. Any honest telling of the story has to begin there, not with paperwork, not with a courtroom, with men in the water waiting for a Navy that did not yet know how badly it had failed them. McVay's name belongs in that story, but not as the simple answer people once tried to make him. It belongs there as a warning. A commander can survive a battle and still be destroyed by the way his country explains it. A disaster can be investigated and still not be fully understood. A record can be corrected and still arrive too late. USS Indianapolis was lost in 12 minutes, but the fight over what that loss meant lasted for decades. The men who died at sea deserve to be remembered. The men who survived deserve to be believed. And the captain who carried the blame deserves to be seen, at last, as part of a much larger truth. Not as an excuse for tragedy, and not as a perfect man, but as proof that even victory can leave unfinished debts for the people ordered to survive it, long after silence.